You're listening to The Abundance Agenda, a podcast about growth and progress. I'm James O'Malley.
And I'm Martin Robbins.
This week, because it's the summer, the weather is nice, everyone is happy, we thought, well, let's dive in on the most contentious possible topic and have a massive fight.
So, James, we're 23 episodes in? It's all been very sort of pleasant and chatty so far. I think it's fair to say that we agree about a lot of things, but there's a kind of underlying unresolved tension that I think some listeners may have detected. And I think it's time that we finally address it on the podcast and confront the big schism that's between us that might bring this whole thing crashing to a halt.
Are we finally going to get to the bottom of the definition of the word staycation, Martin? Because even from your definition a few weeks ago, when you claimed it was just staying at home and doing DIY, other people have said, no, a staycation, you have to do holiday-like things while staying at home. You have to go and visit a castle or something. You can't just do up the spare room.
I mean, fair, but they're wrong. But let's not get into that, because otherwise this is going to be a 2-hour podcast instead of a 1-hour podcast, and I don't think anyone wants that to happen. But no, the conflict, I guess, between us is that you, James, are a naive, hopelessly optimistic AI enthusiast who thinks basically that the machine is going to come and save us all from the drudgery of day-to-day life, whereas I'm much more on the grizzled, angry, skeptical side of things, casually dismissing these great advances. And of course, this week we've seen the release of GPT-5, the latest version from OpenAI of their chatbot, to sum it up in a very dismissive kind of way. And it seems like a really good time for us to hash it out, because fundamentally, I think you believe that this is a technological revolution on par with the automobile or the internet, whereas I think it's fair to say that I probably disagree. Is that about right, James?
Yeah, I definitely think it could be a big deal, but I do want to qualify that, Martin, because I don't want to sound insane. I definitely think AI is a significant technological moment for the world, and I don't want to sort of underplay this because, if you look at ChatGPT, not so long ago, the things it was capable of were basically completely unthinkable. When ChatGPT first came out in 2022, running GPT-3, I think it was at the time, though language models had existed for many years beforehand, it basically revealed to the world that if you throw enough compute at a problem, then you do get something special or important or noteworthy emerging. And it looks a lot like intelligence, and that is sort of incredible. So I guess what frustrates me about the whole AI conversation, and the reason I think this is such a tetchy issue for a lot of people, is you do get a lot of reflexive cynicism when it comes to the topic, and a lot of motivated reasoning, I think, from a lot of AI critics, because the people who invented this technology, they're the evil tech bros. They're powerful and very annoying. Elon Musk is the perfect avatar of everything people find annoying about tech guys. And so, you look back at the last few years, people have had their fingers burnt with crypto turned to shit. NFTs, obviously nonsense from the beginning. The metaverse, that's not really turned out to be anything at all. And this was all hyped up by the same people who are now going, AI is this really big deal. But I think this time, maybe it could be different.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there's almost like an overcorrection in response to just a sheer volume of hype. As you say, it's an interesting technology, right? And I think it is fascinating that you can basically take language and statistical models of language, and you can start to almost extract the thought and the intelligence that produced that language over time. But I think where it becomes difficult then is that, you have key figures talking about incredible things like there's going to be a new industrial revolution, or humans are going to be brought to the brink of extinction, or possibly there's even going to be job losses in the publishing industry. And when you're faced with these sorts of absurd speculations, it's understandable that people start to become a bit alarmed by it, but also push back on it. But I think what's interesting as well is that a lot of the criticism kind of also absorbs the hype.
Yeah, I think this is how you can sort of tell that a lot of the criticism doesn't really work because a lot of the critics, for instance, at the same time, they argue that LLMs, large language models, are a stupid thing that doesn't work at all. They're useless. It's just fancy autocomplete. They also, in the same breath, they say, but also AI, it's morally bad and it's going to destroy society in some various ways. Where I don't think you can be both useless and evil at the same time. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, and I think that probably slightly explains my sanguine attitude to it in the sense that at least I'm kind of consistent, which a lot of critics really aren't. But there's three things that I want to get into here. So the first, I guess, is the state of the technology itself. Then there's the reaction to it, but also the kind of cultural moment that the reaction is taking place within. And because this is a podcast about abundance, how does this actually lead us to abundance, and what does this actually mean for that? And I'm going to pull slightly the expert card here. I don't really like doing this because I don't think anyone's really an expert on this technology yet. But one thing that kind of bugs me in this discussion is that most of the people talking about it haven't really worked on it in a serious context. Whereas I've actually worked in and around AI for the best part of 20 years. I've implemented or attempted to implement LLMs within a proper enterprise products for big pharma. I've worked on how they can be used in areas like drug discovery. I've looked at integrating them with knowledge graphs in order to improve the accuracy of them. And one of my frustrations with this is that so much of the discussion is being driven by these wide-eyed, optimistic journalists who are basically just using it to look stuff up or do a bit of light vibe coding. And for me, that's not a serious enough test of the technology.
I always knew you were a shill for Big Pharma, Martin.
What can I say, James? I'm against disease.
But it is interesting that you mention journalists there as being too wide-eyed and enthusiastic, because from my perspective, I can't think of a group of people who seem to hate and dismiss AI more. When I'm scrolling through my timeline, I just see an endless barrage of hate and cynicism from the sort of journalist community, and that's what makes me feel a bit out of place, because I'm slightly more enthusiastic about AI or optimistic about it, I guess, than the median journalist, and that makes me completely weird by their standards.
Yeah, but I think our timelines are a reflection of who we've cultivated. And, James, if your timeline is full of hate and cynicism, then maybe that's your own fault. But I think there's different groups of people in the discourse, right? So yeah, sure, there are the skeptic journalists, the Freddie de Boers, the various other figures on the sort of liberal left who are very concerned about their technology. But you also have the New York Times running essentially special issues on AI and stuff that amounts almost to AI fan fiction. You have the constant discussion around things like the singularity or a jobs apocalypse or human extinction being treated as a serious thing that's worthy of discussion. And the balance of discussion, even when it comes to the criticism of AI, overwhelmingly seems to follow the massive hype side of things, that it's going to be an enormous revolution and it's literally going to change our existence in the next 5 years, say. But even leaving that aside and just coming back to the technology, I do think the technology is interesting and even good. I think where I kind of draw the line is I don't think that this is an enterprise level technology. I don't think it's something that can currently make the kind of changes in industry that you would need for this to trigger a full-on industrial revolution. I think it's more like a nice thing for knowledge workers.
I think that's where we actually maybe disagree, Martin, and that's probably the root of our big clash here. It's that I can believe that LLMs can't do drug discovery or technically difficult, high scientific discovery type things, but I guess it's how you define what serious actually means, because, if you're just looking stuff up or rewriting stuff or vibe coding or whatever else people are doing with LLMs, well, that's all still quite useful and quite an innovative new technology that will change how we work. I mean, again, this is sort of what frustrates me about a lot of the commentary on AI, because it seems obvious to me that if we stopped all AI innovation tomorrow, say GPT-5 was as good as large language models are ever going to get, then that will still be a really massive deal for the world. So, there's hundreds of millions of people already using these technologies. They've picked it up organically. And I suspect a lot of this is sort of, talking of enterprise uses, a lot of it's going to be sort of quote unquote shadow IT. This is just going to be the lower level people in the office realizing, hang on, I can do my job much more easily by having ChatGPT do the hard work of writing this email for me or something like that. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who works in a communications job for a science organization, and he tells me all the time about how different aspects of his job, because, he's there doing a lot of the hard work of just making things happen in the office, whether it's putting on events or putting out newsletters and publications, saying, here's a meeting here and that sort of thing. A lot of the things he has to do can be helped with a large language model, like whether it's just writing a formal invitation email, whether it's turning a meeting agenda into a retrospective, here's what we discussed at the meeting thing to put on the newsletter that goes around, all these little tiny things. And I just can't help but look at this and see, well, if you're saving a couple of minutes from all of these little tasks you have in your job, add that up to everyone across the entire economy, and that's an enormous productivity improvement. The sort of cumulative impact of all those little changes, that's surely going to be quite a big deal. And, I've worked in jobs like this before as well. So when you're there doing a lot of the grunt work, you can easily see if your job is just, you've got to copy and paste this set of addresses and put them into a slightly different format or something like that. This is where LLMs, I think, can be really useful. And I think a lot of the skepticism as well comes from people who have these sort of quite elite jobs.
Who are you talking about, James?
Well, I always see fancy people go, well, AI could never do my job. And it's always a really specialist job. It's funny you mention the New York Times, because actually I keep thinking of a column. This is from a little while ago, so maybe he's changed his mind now, from the Pope of Abundance, Ezra Klein, who basically said at some point, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't see how AI could do my job. But you're a columnist for the New York Times, one of the most prestigious jobs in the world. And you ring people up and insiders tell you political secrets and so on. Of course, it can't do that. But if you're lower down the pecking order, I think it can do. And a really good example of this, right? Teaching, right? So maybe we can't discover new drugs with large language models, but if you want to teach a 10-year-old how photosynthesis works, surely something like ChatGPT or something fundamentally using the similar sort of technology, but maybe with a better interface or whatever, could do a pretty good job at conveying how that works on a sort of personalized way to kids in schools. I wrote a whole big take on my Substack a while back about how I think AI could change how schools work, and it upsets a lot of teachers. But I fundamentally think, once every student has a little thing in their pocket which can teach them on a one-to-one basis and customize the teaching specifically for them, that seems like quite a big deal. So I just can't see how this isn't going to be a significant thing that affects the world.
So it's interesting to unpack that, right? So I think the first part is there. I'll try and unpack your massive essay that you've just directed at me, James. I think as an alternative to something like Google, it's an incredibly powerful technology. I think what it's best at, and a lot of the examples you've given are good examples of this, right, is quickly distilling common knowledge into something that you can now review or work with. So to give an example, when I was looking for a new job a few months ago, I had ChatGPT generate interview questions for me based on the role and suggest good ways to answer those questions, because it's something where there's thousands of these things online. And yes, I could Google and I could go through lots of different sites and compile lists of questions from them, but ChatGPT will just do that very effectively, give a very good summary. The precise accuracy of it doesn't really matter too much. It's just bringing inspiration and something that I can pick up and work with.
So how did ChatGPT tell you to answer the question, so what's your biggest weakness?
Being human, James. Apparently that's a terribly weak thing and we should all stop immediately. But no, if you're a coder, for example, and you want to know how to do a common function in Python or Java or some other language, maybe you want to build a rough version of a basic user interface, it's brilliant. It's basically fulfilling the role of something like Stack Overflow, where you have forums for developers, they can ask specific questions and the community will respond to them. And it's very good at picking up that kind of content and tailoring answers for a particular purpose. I think the challenge, though, is that, to take Google as an example, businesses aren't really paying for Google. People use Google and they use it all the time. They use it on a daily basis, so much that it's even a verb to Google. But it's not really ever been something that people were willing to actually pay for en masse, other than through kind of passive advertising. And yeah, Google is a massive phenomenon, and I'd put ChatGPT on a similar kind of level. But that doesn't make it an industrial revolution, even though it's incredibly useful for a lot of people.
No, I agree with that, Martin, because, I use ChatGPT more or less constantly in my life now. Don't get me wrong, when I write my articles for my Substack, don't worry, readers, that is still, out of my brain. But it's there as a sort of companion to check things or look things up or inspire things. When I interview people on this show, if they're a public figure, I will ask ChatGPT to put together a briefing on who they are and their political positions, so I can sort of predict what they might say in the interview. I'll ask them what they think about various abundance-related topics, and we've spoken to a few new MPs on this show who don't have the longest Wikipedia pages. So I've had ChatGPT write me a briefing where it's gone through every local news story about this person cut a ribbon here or whatever to try and work out, what they actually care about. So it's been really effective at stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think, again, it's really good for stuff like that because it can kind of coast on vibes a little bit. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter if every specific thing it says is accurate because you're basically trying to get the overall impression from a number of different sources. But it's once you want to get to that higher level of rigor that you start running in problems. So another application that I used professionally was the deep research tool for market research and competitor analysis. So, I was leading a product used by Big Pharma for drug discovery. And I was really interested in, for example, what are some other projects in the pharma industry that are using generative AI to help researchers find new information in their data, so I can compare our efforts to those. And this is where you start to run into trouble because it's brilliant at finding interesting, relevant links that I might have missed in a Google search. And I think it's kind of telling that a lot of the hype about how good ChatGPT is now also kind of reflects on how bad Google is at this point compared to 10 or 15 years ago. It's become atrocious. But when ChatGPT then tries to summarize those sources, almost every response would have some kind of level of error in it. Very often, for example, if you had maybe a page that describes several different projects, it would struggle to attach the right information to the right project. So you have all of these sorts of errors that mean ultimately you've still got to make sure that you go back and do the work and check it yourself. It's a great starting point, but it's not solving the entire problem that a professional person is paid to solve.
So is part of the problem that basically ChatGPT, and I'm using that as a stand-in for, Gemini and Grok and all the other ones, is it the problem that these are basically just tech demos at this point? I mean, we interact with them in a sort of chat style window, but is it not the underlying model that's important? And over the next decade or so, we're going to see actually useful emergent capabilities come from companies turning this basic technology into actual products that people can use, to the point where some AI capability becomes a button on a toolbar or an app that does specific things, but underlied by a large language model in a sort of more controlled way so it can actually do useful things.
So I think there's definitely an element where if a new technology comes along, people have to learn how to use it. And I think people always underestimate that. Like, the internet was around in the 70s and 80s, but it took until the mid 90s to get to the World Wide Web and really until sort of 2000 before you had broadband everywhere, and 5 years more after that to get to social media. And then it's been downhill all the way since there. But yeah, even revolutionary new technologies take 10 or 20 years for people to figure out how to get the most out of them. And there's nothing about AI that's really any different to that, which I think is one reason why I've always been very skeptical about the whole, in 5 years' time, everyone's going to be sitting on their sofa wondering, about the job that the AI took over, because life just does not move that fast fundamentally. But also I think in the technology itself, one of my big issues, and I think a big misconception I see, is the idea that AI innovation is kind of inevitable and it will just continue in a straight line and naturally solve the same problems that we're coming up with over the next few years. Because the issues that you have when you're trying to apply large language models to a serious problem are not a result of bugs in the current models. They're fundamental features of the core technology. The fact that they hallucinate, the fact that they don't actually have any knowledge within them other than what's implied from language, the fact that there's no real reasoning capability in an LLM other than, again, what kind of emerges from the language that it's using. And these things mean it's very hard to use, that it's in a reliable or reproducible way in a serious business setting. So in big pharma, they've spent tens, hundreds of millions of pounds in the last 3 years trying to do exactly what you're describing, which is taking these models and building new products and services around them to try and figure out, how do you move this from a technology demo to something that a scientist can actually use to go through hundreds of scientific papers or trawl through terabytes of data to try and find like links that they might have missed between different drugs and proteins and biomarkers for drug discovery. But it always comes back to the same fundamental limitations. And those limitations didn't actually seem to get any better going from GPC 3.5 to GPC 4 and probably to GPC 5 as well. Because again, the reality is those limitations are fundamental to the technology. As long as you're basing it on the same kind of technology, they will always be there in some form. And you can try and mitigate them and work around them. But in a business setting, and especially for something like pharma, where everything you do has to be repeatable and has to be demonstrated to regulators to be repeatable, it's just not something that you can intrinsically rely on. And so that's always kind of limiting this to, I think, the more sort of consumer grade applications, which is, to be fair, where I think we're seeing the most success with ChatGPT and similar tools at the moment.
Martin, I'm really worried that we don't actually disagree on all that much, even though we set this up as a fight. Because I fundamentally broadly agree with that, I think, but I guess it's a perspective thing, because I guess the sort of divide is whether we think this is something important and world-changing and like you say, an industrial revolution on that sort of scale, or whether this is an important but smaller thing, because maybe, I don't know, can you imagine this technology being on a scale of, say, a YouTube, which changed how we browse the web but didn't fundamentally change technology, or the iPod, which changed how we consume music but didn't change everything else for 3 years? Or even, would you say this is on a par with, I'm just trying to take your temperature on this now, is this on a par with the invention of the smartphone, which again sort of transformed how we engage with technology? If you look at a lot of the paradigm shifts over the last 40 years, we had mainframes, then personal computers, and then we had the internet, and then we had smartphones. Is this the next one of those big deals?
So I think if you look at, say, computers or the internet or smartphones, those are things that have fundamentally changed how we move through life. Like, owning a smartphone means that if you went back to the 1990s now, or if a lot of people went back to 1995 and they didn't have a smartphone, they would be utterly lost at every level, from like, how do I pay for stuff in a shop? How do I even find where the shop is? How do I communicate with my boss at work? Like, how do I reach people? Like, you mean I've got to find a special booth and put coins to it? What is a coin? It's just like so utterly transformative in that period of time that it's like an alien world, basically. I think people massively underestimate how utterly alien like 1993 would seem to most people alive today, even who were there at the time.
This is why I genuinely think, completely unironically, so hate me in the comments for this, that a remake of Back to the Future made today with someone from 2025 going back to 1995 would genuinely be a really good film.
It would be absolutely mind-blowing. And I think even people who were like 20 at the time probably would struggle on some level. But that's the thing. Like, for me, like a real revolution, like the digital revolution, for example, that has fundamentally changed how we work, how we live our lives, how we seek entertainment. You know, the idea of streaming TV on demand in your home, the fact that you can work at home and connect to your office on Slack and Teams and other horrible technologies that we have to use. The fact that everything's coming through email, but then even email has kind of gone out of fashion compared to Slack. The fact that we're all weirdly talking about our jobs in inspirational ways on LinkedIn to other awful people that are on LinkedIn, even how you get food, how you get shopping, how you get takeaways delivered, like everything has changed. Whereas if you look at something like YouTube or Google individually, I think those are closer in the sense that Google is a tool that people use every single day, constantly, multiple times a day. It's transformed how they seek and find information on a daily basis. It's been incredibly valuable for a lot of people, as things like Wikipedia have as well. And so I sort of position it more like there. I think this is something where people will use this technology every single day, but actually the challenge will be monetizing that or building anything kind of more off the back of that. And I think that's sort of where you start to run up against the limits. It's a $20 billion technology, or maybe $100 billion technology, but I don't think it's a $2 trillion technology, if that makes sense.
Martin, you're a hard man to impress. I mean, Google, I think, is still a pretty big deal. You know, it made the internet legible at scale. The last 20 years would be really different if we didn't have Google. So, you know, maybe LLMs aren't as big as the steam engine, but even if they're only as big as Google, if a new company as big and as powerful as Google suddenly appeared, well, that would be quite a big, impactful thing.
Oh, sure, but Google didn't really put people out of work other than Alta Vista, or fundamentally like change the economy in the way that like a computer did. And there's not even that much evidence that it made people particularly more productive. Like we still have researchers, we still look things up, and that there's also a little bit of a sense that maybe some of these tools, it's like, great, ChatGPT can write the first version of this report for me. Now I can go and have a nap. Like, is it necessarily resulting in greater productivity? And I think some of this also comes back to the fact that a lot of the tech hype is from people who I think are not actually that great at understanding what people actually do at work all day.
I get that. I think the reason maybe we haven't seen the same productivity boost from technology that we were perhaps expecting is because, unfortunately, the machine that can make us more productive, it's also the distraction machine. You know, when I get up in the morning, I need a good 2 or 3 hours of sort of aimlessly strolling around the internet before I'm ready to do any actual work. And I'm sure it's the same for everyone.
Yes, I mean, maybe less than 2 hours, but, you know, we each have our own pace in the morning. I just like to sit with a towel over my head and pretend that the world doesn't exist for at least an hour or two until I've had a Coke Zero to perk me up. But it's what's important about what you do. So to give a really basic example, in my current job, we're trying to put a support rota in place among the engineers. And that is a very common and normal thing for a software company to do. There are tons of articles about the best way to do it. And ChatGPT is brilliant at summarizing that and saying, hey, this is how you should implement a support rota in your business. And that's fantastic. But the problem is, I think a lot of tech people see that and they think, oh, look, ChatGPT has this knowledge that it can produce. Therefore, it could be the manager. Like, why do you need a product manager or an engineering manager to put these things in place? Because they're fixated on the idea that it's the facts and the knowledge that's what matters. But actually, in any real business, the hard work is the implementation. It's making these things work with the real human beings in your organization, in your circumstances. That's 95% of the job.
You've just given me a horrific vision of the future, Martin. I thought it was going to be bad when bosses started getting younger than I am. I mean, that's already happened, but now the future is going to be being sat down by your boss, ChatGPT, to be told you're not working hard enough.
You know, it's just a terminal window of disappointment streaming into your face. But it's the same with coding, for example. So I think something that lay people don't understand about software development is that if you're a developer, if you're someone that produces software, the actual coding is probably about 20% of your job. Most of the rest of it is looking at architecture or testing or like other parts of the coding process. But actually generating the code, similar to being a professional writer, is not actually the biggest part of the job that you're doing. And often you're using, you know, very highly optimized development environments or workflows that are making this quite efficient to begin with. And so the gains are sort of 10, 20% gains. They're not 100% gains.
But I think that's what drives me a bit mad with a lot of the naysaying. Now, I agree. I'm not like a wide-eyed libertarian tech bro who thinks this is necessarily definitely going to change the world. But I think if everyone's job became that 20% easier, then that's still a massive deal. You know, when washing machines were invented, did people go, oh, sure, it's cleaning the clothes, but it's not drying them and folding them and putting them in the cupboard as well. So what's the big deal? But in any case, so Martin, I can buy your skepticism, but at the same time, we already see reports of people who say, oh, they've lost work due to AI. Lots of coders, there's a whole sort of meme in sort of Silicon Valley now, I think, about how coders just aren't being hired because people are using AI to do it instead. I think there was one fairly prominent company, I think it was Shopify, the shopping platform, who said, whenever we want to hire someone, we've got to try and explain first why we can't just do this job with AI first. And so if they're thinking like that, they must think there's something in it, I guess.
Maybe, but I think a lot of this is down to the fact that there's an awful lot of bullshit on LinkedIn as well. So I think there's several things going on, right? So if you look at the tech industry, which is my industry, and over the last few years, there was a massive, unbelievable surge in hiring and job counts during COVID. Basically, that was the tech industry's time to shine. Everything was going to happen virtually. Everything got digitized overnight so that people could work remotely and from home. And so there was an enormous hiring glut. And then immediately after the pandemic, interest rates went up, which made money more expensive to borrow. And borrowing money is basically the engine of the tech industry. Also, a lot of those companies that had overhired then saw a bit of a downturn in how services were being used as they went back to work. And so a hiring environment where basically anyone who looks like they could code could walk into a very well-paid job changed overnight and became a lot more difficult. And actually what you see is just that slowdown after the pandemic, and then it starts to come up again. It's still an incredibly strong market compared to most industries, but there's no real evidence that AI is stopping people from hiring, mid-level or junior developers. And when you see a lot of the examples where this is supposedly happening, you get people who are saying, "Oh, I've applied to 1,000 jobs and not a single one has come back to me." And when you look at their post in a bit more detail, you find that actually it's because they want to live in a cabin in Alaska and they refuse to attend meetings at any normal times. And they're just very sort of privileged people who are having a bit of a sulk because they're not treated like kings anymore and they're very, very bad at applying for jobs. Similarly, you could look at areas like the creative industries. So let's say you're a journalist now and you're looking at the rise of AI slop in publishing. That's definitely a problem, but it's a problem in the same way that like Reach is a problem, the company that's kind of assimilated most of the local news websites now and turned them into basically meme slop over the last few years. And that's a function of the market rather than specifically AI. Like these jobs were screwed in a sense anyway. And this is sort of a continuation of that trend that it turns out a lot of consumers are happy clicking on utter slop on Facebook.
That's the really striking thing. I think Facebook have discovered in recent years that what your friends are doing is actually quite boring, and what people really want, and this is our revealed preference because this is why we keep seeing it, it's just slop on the feed. Whenever I scroll through my Facebook feed now, it's crappy memes. It's like you click on one link about a Marvel film, so then the rest of your timeline transforms into actor says this about this in the Marvel film, and it's just garbage for the mind.
Yeah, it's horrendous, and just headlines that are just obviously absolutely nonsense, but are just put up for the clicks. I think one of the most interesting examples, though, of an industry impacted by AI is actually translation and machine translation, because this is an industry, of all industries that we're talking about, this should be the canary in the coal mine, because Google Translate has been good for about 10 or 11 years now, basically. Since it got to the point where it could pretty much translate between most languages to a reasonable standard. And every kind of prediction would be that would have absolutely destroyed the translation industry. But 10 years later, and this is after 3 years of ChatGPT as well, it is absolutely thriving. It's not just thriving, it's actually one of the best growth industries in certainly the US over the last 5 or 10 years. Like wages have grown faster than the average economy. The market has grown overall. There's higher demand for translation than there's been for any other point during human history. And once you start to look at that, you realize actually the same thing happened with Excel and accountants, because Excel, it's kind of hard to imagine now, but it automated a large part of the jobs that accountants were doing. Because they would literally, like spreadsheets were a thing on paper, and they would literally have to spend all day, like, when you drag the rectangle down and it auto calculates the entire column, they'd be sitting there going cell by cell on their piece of paper, like doing the calculations all day to try and make these things happen. And suddenly that takes like a second, but it didn't put them out of work. What it meant was that actually those services were then accessible to larger and larger markets more and more cheaply, and the individual accountants were much more productive. So suddenly the kind of value that they can generate in the world increases. And that turned out to be a very beneficial thing. So I think, again, a lot of the doomster stuff around everyone's going to be out of a job, it's not really backed up by how these things have gone on any previous technology or even in earlier iterations of this technology.
Well, this I think it's called Jevons paradox or Jevons paradox, where you make something cheaper and suddenly it becomes more popular as more people want to do it, and then from scale, that's where you get the real value. And ironically, a lot of people say that about AI. If you remember a while back now, when DeepSeek, the Chinese language model, came out, for a while there was these really stupid takes that were like, well, nobody's going to care about AI now, or look at all these stupid tech investments into data centers and so on, with everyone forgetting that if you make it cheaper, suddenly demand for compute and stuff will go up. But anyway, Martin, from what you're saying though, with translation and with Excel and so on, it sounds a bit like that despite you being an arch skeptic, it sounds like you're saying LLMs can transform the economy after all.
Yeah, I mean, they can a bit in the same way that Google or Excel can. I just don't see any evidence that it's an industrial revolution. And I think the big challenge here is that it's very, very hard now to have a rational discussion about AI, which we're just about managing to do, because the extremes in the discourse are just so enormous. It's either absolute Luddites or it's people who are basically buying bunkers in New Zealand because of the impending AI rapture that's coming. Yeah, you've got people talking about artificial general intelligence when the technology is not capable of basic reasoning and has no actual knowledge within it to reason on. You've got Mark Zuckerberg saying AI smart glasses will replace iPhones, which I'll be honest, I don't think is going to happen. And Mark Zuckerberg is his own sort of special case of someone who is consistently wrong about the future. But it's kind of created this space where, certainly in some tech circles, if you don't believe that this is the next coming of Jesus or the next industrial revolution, you're kind of treated like a mad Luddite.
Oh, Martin, we should do an episode on those smart glasses at some point, because I think there's something in it. Is that terrible to admit? But we will get onto that at a later point. But no, I think, like you said earlier, I think this reveals where we actually have pretty similar views, but we see things differently, because I guess there you are working in tech, feeling like the Luddite because you're not as wide-eyed as the wide-eyed Silicon Valley people around you. Whereas, I spend my life down in the mud with Westminster types who are all miserable cynics who really hate the tech bros, so want this stuff to fail. So again, I guess we're not so different. It's just that the people around us are what are colouring our perceptions.
Exactly. So I'm going to lean into the cynicism here, and I'm going to borrow a trick from your playbook, James, and I'm going to attempt to make a bad prediction. Because obviously this is what you're famous for. You're the person who bought the e-scooter. Obviously your predictions on the nuclear industry are famous from past episodes. So now this is my turn to try and make a prediction that's going to be hilariously wrong. And my prediction is that these technologies in probably the next few years, so not many iterations after GPT-5, are going to start getting worse. I don't think we're far from the peak, and I reckon by the time we get to, let's say, 2030 to 2035 at the outside, they'll be worse to use than they are today.
Okay, everyone, stop what you're doing. Put this in your calendar. We are going to check back in on this, Martin. You will be held to account with this bold prediction. So what is your basis for making this claim?
So I think there's two inescapable trends which are coming for AI. One of them is enshittification, and the other is the far right, effectively, or the new right. So nice, good stuff to get into.
Oh, good. We're talking about the far right. What could possibly be terrifying about that?
Absolutely. So here's a question, James. Which of these is the odd one out? NVIDIA, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Jeff Bezos and Amazon, Elon Musk, Sam Altman? Which of those do you think is the outlier?
Let me have a think. So I guess Sam Altman hasn't made his billions yet, I don't think. I'm sure he's doing wrong. I'm sure he's doing all right and is not worrying about paying his mortgage, but I don't think he's quite as wealthy as the others. Other than that, they're all sort of tech titans, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say they're all rich, they're all tech people. But for me, the odd one out is Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. And the reason for this is that if you look at all of the others, so Google, Microsoft, Amazon, SpaceX, even Tesla to some extent, OpenAI, all of these, I think, are best thought of not as tech companies, but actually infrastructure companies. So Google, Microsoft, Amazon, they all run large-scale compute, basically data centers and centers packed with processors that run all of the machine learning and the computer power that powers the modern economy, and which other companies have to buy and use. If you're any kind of startup in the tech industry, you are almost certainly paying Google, Amazon, or Microsoft for all of the computing power that you're using to run your applications in the cloud. Amazon obviously also has its physical distribution network, so it has warehouses and cargo and infrastructure in the real world between those. Elon Musk wants to build essentially the Amazon distribution network in space with Falcon and Starship for larger and larger amounts of cargo, and is also building the communications network with Starlink. And then NVIDIA is kind of building the steam engines of the modern economy, the actual processing units that do the computation for all of this. So they're effectively like the kind of Victorian barons during the age of the railroads, where they're building out the machines and the railways and the routes for cargo and things to move around that then power the economy of the period. And in all of this, it's Facebook or Meta that's the odd one out. And you can kind of see that by the way that Mark Zuckerberg is just constantly sort of publicly shitting himself. It tried to be basically a layer of the internet originally. So it was going to be the thing that you built the rest of the internet on. And, there was that brief period of time where you'd see increasing number of sites using Facebook as a login. And that was all part of that play. But that never really happened. And then it bet hugely on the metaverse and put tens of billions into that. But it turned out people don't actually want to have work meetings with bad avatars of their colleagues. That's not really popular at all. So that's kind of failed. And so now the Zuck is all in on AI, but ultimately it's an infrastructure play. What he believes and the rest of them believe is that whoever builds the machine learning platforms that other businesses use will basically be the kind of people who are receiving the rents from all businesses in the future, and that'll make them rich.
So OpenAI is building infrastructure that other companies will use to build products and services, and then Microsoft and Google and Amazon are all trying to get a piece of that pie. Actually, interestingly, the thing that I think is really interesting about what Meta have done and what Zuckerberg has done is they're trying to be the Android of this. So Llama, their large language model, they've made it open source so that anyone can develop it. And the idea there, as I understand it, and I'm stealing this analysis from Ben Thompson, who writes a really good blog called Stratechery, is that basically the idea is that their bet is that these foundation models will become commoditized, they'll become interchangeable, and they don't want to be held at the mercy of whichever one is best. So if they can sort of stimulate an open source alternative, then it won't mean that, Microsoft or OpenAI or Google or whoever has them over a barrel, because like you say, they've not got the underlying infrastructure ready to go. So they can just use whoever's there. And they've actually done a similar thing. They open sourced their underlying server software. It's called the Open Compute Project, so that basically any company now can spin up the sort of servers that Facebook needs and sell that to them, and it's commoditized it and made it cheaper for Facebook to run its servers. So there is some strategy there. But no, I agree. So yeah, these companies, they're all trying to build infrastructure, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And we know how this story ends, which is the quite depressing part. So Cory Doctorow calls it enshittification. That's the term that he coined for basically the phenomenon where the products begin to degrade as the business model evolves. And you can see how ChatGPT is basically stage one of that process. So the first step is you build this useful product or service, whether it's Facebook, ChatGPT, and you effectively provide that at a massive loss to get people hooked on it. So essentially, ChatGPT exists in economic terms to promote Microsoft's Azure compute service. That's the kind of the halo thing that it's trying to drive people to. So the idea is ChatGPT runs at a loss, people use it, businesses get excited about it, and then those businesses want to integrate it into their own products. And in order to do that, they have to buy access through Microsoft Azure, which is the cloud computing platform that Microsoft provides to startups and businesses. Now, Microsoft can't make money by putting a fancier paperclip in Microsoft Office. Like nobody's paying billions of dollars extra for that. So it needs to sell the other technology to other companies that are building products on top of it. And so it's a playering building up all of this hype. And because of that hype, the startups start to build the services into their products, and they buy access to Azure or the Amazon version or the Google version to do this. And then you've got to phase two of the enshittification process, which is you've hooked the users, you've now hooked the suppliers that are building products for those users. But now you've kind of reached saturation. Like you've reached peak hype. You've got this thing. You've got all these businesses using your services. There's no real incentive to develop it any further. And actually what you want to do now is just reduce costs, tweak it in ways that are going to meet slightly different commercial goals for your organization. And so in the same way that Google search results have visibly declined over recent years because they're no longer really aimed at finding the best knowledge or providing the best experience, they're really just trying to optimize revenue for Google. It's pretty inevitable, I think, that the same will happen with GPT over the coming years.
So let's say I buy this. I think I do, but that's a whole other debate. But in your view, how can we prevent this? So if enshittification is inevitable, are we just doomed, or can we stop AI becoming enshittified?
So I think there's basically three ways that this can go, and all of them are bad. But I think there
Which
might
is the
be
least bad, Martin?
Well, but I think under all of them, there's kind of a silver lining, which I think finally drags us back to abundance, and which I think is actually really interesting and positive for the future. So the first outcome is, as we've said, the technology becomes enshittified. The second is that it never actually reaches that potential in the first place, or in other words, it's not even good enough to become shit. So, and again, not to relitigate the previous argument, but for me, the AI summaries in Google are garbage. AI features and other tools are pretty mixed outside of the technology demo that is ChatGPT. Unless the technology gets radically better and demonstrates its value in other products, there's a pretty good chance that it fails to live up to the insane hype, and it kind of falls out of favor. And we're already seeing this in some industries where projects were kicked off with big investment in 2023 when ChatGPT became a massive thing. And we're now reaching the point where companies are, 2 years down the road, they've put millions of pounds into it. They've got a kind of flaky demo that sometimes works, and you start to see a little bit of a cooling, which obviously, if it continued, could end up with a substantial downturn in the industry. But it's the third outcome that I think is probably the most intriguing.
Honestly, I don't know where you're going with this, Martin. Is it the singularity? The idea that we're going to hit this point and suddenly technology becomes a self-perpetuating thing that always improves, and we have robots taking care of us and we live lives of luxury?
No, so the singularity is utter bollocks, and I can't be bothered to get into it right now because we're already about 20 minutes over time. But if people want to learn more about that, check out my Substack on Monday because I've got a piece going up that addresses that. But no, what I'm talking about here, James, is Mecha Hitler.
Oh no, so this is Grok, I guess. I don't know if anyone missed this, but Elon Musk's LLM, his chatbot Grok, it turned into a Nazi briefly a few weeks ago, as people might remember.
We've all had phases, James.
It got into its awkward teenage years, spending a lot of time on the internet, reading some, awful stuff on social media. Basically, Musk, it appears, tried to tone down the political correctness of the bot by giving it an instruction in its pre-prompt. Because, sorry, this is an aside. The mad thing about LLMs ultimately, and this is what people don't often appreciate, is they're just a bunch of numbers. And when you actually put controls on an LLM to stop it doing stuff or to tell it how to answer questions, all these AI companies are doing is asking it nicely in plain English. They're just appending an English language instruction ahead of whatever you say. So whenever you're asking it to do whatever you want to do, before that, it always says, do not be racist. Try
Please
and be
don't
fair
be
and
a
balanced.
Nazi.
Yeah, and there was this sort of thing. They literally changed the pre-prompt to just add in something that said, so it was something like, don't be afraid to give an edgy response or an unpolitically correct response or something like that. And yet it very quickly descended into talking about how it loved Hitler and liked Mecha Hitler or something like that. It was not great.
Yes, I think not great is a fair summary, James. I think some might even use stronger language than that. But Grok is the kind of manifestation of an emerging movement around the tech industry and the new right. So this is the sort of the pro-Trump alt-right side of the industry, the people who literally want to abolish universities, destroy the institutions of the liberal elite, and actually install a kind of CEO king in the White House with an aristocracy of shareholders, which I know sounds like I've made it up, but is actually a real belief of a large section of this movement. and essentially one of the core philosophies of that group is the idea that basically all of the trappings of the liberal elite, basically high culture, must be destroyed. And so they talk in memes and bad jokes. And I think you kind of see that philosophy in Grok. It's whether it's intentional or not, the purpose that's kind of manifested through it is to basically destroy knowledge and culture like a kind of automated internet troll. And that's another possible outcome for the future of this technology, is that basically we just end up with a kind of angry, racist chatbot trolling liberals for laughs all day.
I'll be honest, Martin, I've spent a lot of time on Twitter over the years, and I don't think we need to invent a new technology that can do racism more efficiently and more of it. I think we've got enough.
Imagine racism at scale, like or racism as a service.
Okay, Martin, I think you said a while back now, it was like 20 minutes ago, that this could be a positive outcome, and yet we're somehow talking about Mecha Hitler. So what the hell?
Well, so I think that the thing that maybe could come out of all of this, however it goes, is actually cheap compute. So if the AI bubble bursts, all of those data centers, all the renewable energy that was built to power them, all of that computer processing power will basically be sitting idle. And that's fantastic if you're, for example, an innovative small startup that wants to be able to do interesting things with technology. I think one of the things that people don't really understand unless they work in the industry is that basically all tech companies now, startups, have to pay a huge tax to one of the major cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, or Google, to be able to access that compute and use these machine learning services at scale. Essentially, the big tech is like the old turnpike barons from the 1700s or the 1800s, where every time you wanted to get on a road between London and Maidenhead, you'd have to pay a toll to some rich person for the privilege. So if prices crash and if big tech loses its stranglehold on some of that infrastructure, if it all becomes much cheaper for people to use, if machine learning chips and processors become a commodity, that's fantastic for innovation, just like cheap roads were fantastic at the end of the 19th century for the economic growth and expansion that happened there. So we could potentially, at the end of all of this, see the end of a number of years of tech stagnation, where it's kind of felt like most of our products haven't got better since about 2012, frankly, and perhaps the rise of new competitors to take their place.
I agree with you here, Martin. I think we've finally got some sort of agreement with it. It's really interesting that you describe it as a tax, and I sort of completely buy that metaphor. But it is really interesting to think about what a big deal the cloud was as well, because when Google first started many years ago, one of the problems it had in its early days was scaling its infrastructure to match demand. And back then, you couldn't just spin up the cloud because the cloud didn't exist. So they literally had to work out how to acquire computer parts and build data centers quickly enough. So the fact that this is like another step down, so then the cloud comes out, so now starting a tech company, you've already got a lot of the infrastructure there at the end of a credit card ready to go. And if we can then just make that cheaper, that does mean, people can build even more. And I think it's within that compute gap that you described that we can do really interesting things, because I guess, we've talked in this discussion, about LLMs. That's really what we're talking about when we're talking about AI, the large language models, the chat GPTs, but more broadly in terms of sort of things you can do with the chips that LLMs run on. So GPUs, parallel computing type tasks. There's so much more that can be done there in terms of innovation, in terms of machine learning or simulation and so on. So if we can make all this much cheaper, that's when we could theoretically get other new innovations. Amazon invented the cloud actually because they had all of this extra compute lying around. They had all these extra servers lying around, which they have ready to go for Christmas time when everyone's on Amazon. But they thought, well, in the meantime, it's summer. Let's just sell this capacity to other companies so they can host their websites on our infrastructure as well. And SMS text messaging, that actually emerged because there was this extra capacity on mobile phone networks, just not enough for full calls, but in terms of just sending short messages, and someone thought, hang on, we could do this new thing. And from that, we got text messages. So I'm quite excited about the idea of having loads of extra compute, whether it's for LLMs or not, because that means we can do more with it and we can invent more stuff.
Yeah. It turns out that abundance is a good thing, James.
So I think we've got some sort of agreement there, to the extent we disagree anyway. But so can we write off LLMs yet? Maybe not. Let us know what you think in the comments. I'd be curious to what our very smart and informed audience have to think. But so who knows? Let's see how it goes. And we'll check back in on your prediction in 2030, Martin. And if you're wrong, we will hold you to account.
And I think it is almost 2030 now, judging by how long we've been recording for.
Oh, Martin, that was an exhausting one this week. So let's do some housekeeping. We're going to skip the interview this week. We have got some really good stuff coming in the next few weeks. We've got Ruth Cadbury, the chair of the Transport Select Committee. We've got Sam Friedman, the king of Substack himself, coming up. But you're going to have to subscribe to the pod if you haven't already. Get it in your podcast client so you get our future episodes with our interviews. But in addition to doing the pod, Martin, we write on Substack. So we write Substack newsletters every week. So what are you writing about this week, Martin?
Well, I've got a piece intriguingly titled Plato versus Grok that should be up when the podcast goes live, and you can check that out to understand about the evolution of genius and what the tech industry doesn't really seem to understand about it. And it's a very hard piece to describe. I'm going to be honest right now. It covers a lot of ground. There's some weird stuff in it. Go and check it out. You're going to enjoy it. I'll be honest, I can't even remember what day it is now after the length of the recording session we've just done, but check it out. It's good.
I'm looking forward to reading it.
What have you been working on this week other than this mammoth recording session?
Yeah, I've been similarly high-minded this week in that I went to the supermarket and I couldn't buy a loaf of bread at 5 p.m. on a Sunday because of bloody Sunday trading laws. So I wrote a very long rant about why I think the Sunday trading laws are out of date, are farcical, are complete nonsense, and we should change them and we should function like a normal country. So yeah, go and read that on my Substack. You can find links to both of our articles on abundancepod.com.
And we do occasionally write about stuff that isn't just personal grievances as well, just to be clear about that.
We're slightly better than Matt Goodwin in that respect. So, Martin, we've accidentally reached the end of the show at the usual point. Usually we throw to an interview, but like I say, we're going to forgo the interview this week because people are already sick of us at this point, I think.
Yeah.
So just one last plug for if you're enjoying the show, tell your friends. Get your phone out now, go to WhatsApp, get a link to the pod, send it to 10 of your friends, post it on social media, because the more people who share the show and listen to the show, the more it feeds our massive egos.
Absolutely. And those egos need to be fed.
But for now, I think we're done, Martin. I'm going to go away now and have a lie down after a very long conversation about AI. So yeah, see everyone next week. And for now, thanks for listening.
See you next week.